No idea.
No, basically, you find a book value. In times the interest.
All right. Let's see.
That's a quarter of a month.
So, should see on Canvas, the next assignment, it's kind of got a due date. It's pretty far off in the future. You know, we do have Thanksgiving break in between, you know, when it's assigned and when it's due. So maybe start trying to chip away at the kind of early questions, the stuff we'll cover before break. And then kind of when we come back, we'll have a little bit we'll cover after up until it's due. Any questions for me before we get started today? We don't have a whole lot of housekeeping stuff here. So we've been doing some game theory stuff, and then we started a transition at the end of last class into externalities. Right? So externalities are when, you know, we typically think about it as we've got some demand curve that's telling me the private marginal benefits. We've got some supply curve that's telling me the producers or the private costs. But there could be cost of people outside this market, right? We started thinking about, you know, maybe we can identify the equilibrium quantity and price. The problem is, right, if we've got some other cost to people outside this market or an additional cost to society, we call this an external cost, right? And maybe producing oil creates, you know, pollution. Then it's actually like our marginal social cost curve is going to be higher, right? I guess it's visually higher, but it's going to actually be, you would want the supply curve to be decreased. Right? And there's these huge costs of people in society from pollution. Well, then we want the production of those goods to be a little bit lower. So we can kind of think about this as we've got some supply curve for the firms in the industry that represents their marginal cost. But the marginal costs of society are whatever their marginal costs are, plus this external cost, an example like this external cost of pollution. So it's almost like we have kind of society's marginal cost curve would actually be kind of shifted upwards, right? So we kind of went through some of this last class because we then said, okay, now what's the optimal point for society? Well, it's no longer where the supply and demand curve hit, it's where the demand curve hits my marginal social costs. I want to think about it, it's almost like where they hit society's supply curve, right? Where would society want the supply curve to be? So we kind of see the equilibrium would be what, 20 and get back here. Well, we don't have it here. Sorry. All right. 20, and then their optimal price they would like to set would be 3. Right? So if we compare that to the equilibrium before, let's go back. I think I had it. All right, 25 and 250. If there's negative externalities, society would actually like there to be a lower quantity, equilibrium quantity in the market, and price of 3, a higher than the equilibrium price. Yeah.
Is that society as like the producers or the consumers?
So up to this point, right? Supply and demand just reflected the producers, consumers of that good in that market, right? So let's think about, I might use this example later, so I will use this. Let's say I'm not religious at all, right? So I don't want to, I'm not involved in the market for the supply or consumption of church services, right? And so if that's the case, there could be some externalities of those churches exist, right? That might produce an additional cost or benefit to me. So this social cost curve is including people that are not involved in the production or consumption of this good at all. Does that help clarify those? So think about it as, for instance, I'm not a smoker, so I am not involved in the production or consumption of cigarettes. But if someone around me is smoking, I have a huge negative cost because I really don't like the smell of cigarettes, right? And so I have this huge kind of negative externality. I'm part of society. I'm not part of this market, but I am one of the people in society who's bearing this additional cost. So for me, the optimal amount of cigarettes smoked, right, would be lower, and the price, corresponding price would be higher.
Okay.
Is that? Yeah.
Can it be opposite? Like can the social costs be like more? Does that make sense?
So you're thinking about if there's, so here the social cost is higher.
Yes,
Could the social cost ever be lower?
yeah, that's what it is.
Yeah, so there we're thinking about maybe we've got, well, we typically don't. I'll show you an example of this maybe at the end of class, but we typically don't think about, so if there's additional costs, that's what we're looking at here. If there's the opposite of that, that's actually meaning there's additional benefits. So if we have additional benefits, which one of these curves probably fits? Well, my demand curve reflected just the consumer's marginal benefits. So society's marginal benefits would be that plus the additional benefit. So if it ever kind of has not a cost, but a benefit to other people, we actually see kind of a shift in the demand curve. Now, doesn't matter, you could actually draw it through supply and demand. Shifting the supply or demand curve, and it leads to the same implications. But it's easier to think about that when we have additional costs, because the supply curve reflects marginal cost, society's kind of supply curve will be higher. If there's additional benefits, well, then society's demand curve would shift. It's a good question, though. Does that kind of get at what you're asking? So, you can think about it here, you know, we could get a quantity even lower, right? You know, society's gonna like that, but as we reduce the production, yes, society might benefit, but now the producers are gonna get hurt. So where is society's total surplus maximized? So I think I've got it here in the slide, but I'll try to give you, I think drawing it maybe is a little bit easier. So I've got my demand curve, which reflects marginal benefits, supply curve, which reflects marginal costs. And we kind of think about, here's my marginal social cost, or the marginal cost plus whatever this external cost or this negative externality was. So where would society like this to be, or where would surplus be maximized for society? Would actually be kind of right here. Now it gets a little bit tricky to identify, okay, we're not at an optimal point for society, so there is going to be some deadweight loss. The way that this gets identified is a little bit tricky though. So if we were at society's optimal point, here would be consumer, here would be producer surplus, right? So we're going to kind of now use not the market equilibrium as our kind of reference point, because we're trying to figure out what's allocated efficient, not just for the market, but for society overall. And that would actually be total surplus is maximized right here. Now, if instead we allow the market to operate freely and don't step in, right, we know we're going to get out to this equilibrium. If we do, what does consumer and producer surplus now become? So we can kind of think about it as, well, now, here's my consumer surplus. Here is my producer surplus. Problem is, there's also, I'm not taking into consideration the cost to society. So what are the costs to society here? Well, at every single quantity, the cost to society is the difference between my, is the difference between my supply curve and my marginal social cost curve. Where did I put the, oh, there it is. So society's costs, if I'm producing up to this quantity, is actually going to be this entire area, right? Because if the market operates out to this equilibrium quantity, right, I know that the total social cost will be however many units are produced and however much the external cost is, right? So if the external cost for every unit is $20 and I produce 100 of them, well, then the total would be 2,000. That's what this area would represent, right? So notice before we had like consumer and producer surplus here, we were saying total surplus was maximized because here, even though we've gained all of this surplus, we also lost it, right? So yeah, the producers and consumers gained this additional surplus, but that was counterweight, or that was kind of negated by the fact that, yeah, they benefited maybe $1,000 more, but society's cost was $1,000 there as well. So they just cancel each other out. So it's almost like everything in this range, right, cancels each other out. Notice we've got the same surplus that we had when we said it was society's kind of total surplus maximized, except we've got this additional cost to society, people outside of the market. So that actually is going to represent the reduction in the original surplus, right? So when we let this market freely operate, we get to a point where the costs are so high for people not in this market, any gains that we had from producing more to the consumers and producers is negated by, in fact, negated by the cost of society. In fact, not only is it negated or they cancel it out, it also incurs some additional cost on top of that. So if we're trying to identify deadweight loss here, maybe a non-technical way, because you don't want to go through that kind of drawing process every time. It's trying to give you some intuition as behind why this is representing deadweight loss. Another way of thinking about this is, well, for society, right, what do they lose out on? Well, that's going to be the difference between, what's their net benefit or net cost? What's the difference between society's marginal benefit and their marginal cost? Well, I'll use the board again. So notice, if I want the difference between society's marginal cost, and here without any additional benefits, society's marginal benefit is actually the same as just the original private marginal benefit. So there's no additional benefits here, so they're the exact same thing. So here I can think about it as, here's all the surplus gain for society. Everywhere here, the marginal benefits, right, where I was at in the demand curve, were above society's cost. But if the market produces out at this quantity, well, for every unit past this point, my society's costs are now greater than their benefits, right? So this area kind of represents losses to society, right? The cost to society here are larger than the benefits. So by arriving at this higher quantity, we end up with kind of lower total surplus for society, right? Or think about it maybe a non-technical way. If you go figure out kind of what your optimal quantity is for society, your optimal quantity, if the market just operated freely without taking into consideration anybody not in that market, the difference kind of between your demand curve and your marginal social cost curve would represent your deadweight loss. Questions on that? Yeah.
Does the marginal social cost, does that cut into producer surplus?
So think about it this way. So when I erased all this, it was just, like I said, it was canceled out. There still was, so consumers still had this surplus if we let the market operate freely. And what color did I use? I think I crossed out, but producers still had this as surplus. So it's like when the market operates freely, when we have negative externalities, producers and consumers in that market benefit a lot, right? Consumers and producers of cigarettes benefit a lot from the government not getting involved. However, the benefits that they receive from operating at this kind of perfectly competitive equilibrium is going to have huge cost to society, people outside of that market, right? And so, yes, there's gains to producers and consumers, but those are canceled out by, and then, there's even more cost to people outside that market, who we are kind of calling society. Is that going to help a little bit? Like I said, I wouldn't kind of go through this every single time, because it's hard to envision exactly what's going on with the deadweight loss when it comes to negative externalities. But it really is the idea that, yeah, the people who are producing and consuming this product, they gain a bunch. But as they're gaining, someone is equally losing out. In fact, not only are they equally losing out, at a certain point, they start to lose out even more. Right? Any other questions on that? I know this is kind of tough, so we'll work through some different ways of looking at it. What I want to say here. Oh, I think the point I wanted to make here was what's one way we can solve this issue, right? So let's assume that I've got a negative externality, right? Maybe this is pollution, maybe it's people blowing smoke in my face. So we've got my demand curve, my supply curve, my marginal social benefit curve. Right? So if we let the market operate freely, I call this the perfectly competitive equilibrium and the perfectly competitive equilibrium price. Okay. Now for society, they would like the optimal point for society is actually going to be, we'll kind of call this quantity for society. They would like the quantity to be lower, and they would like, the corresponding prices as a result of that would have to be higher. So what's one way we can, what word am I looking for? What's one way we can get to that point in society, right? What's one way we can kind of remedy this situation? If we just let producers and consumers operate at will, we know that for society, it's going to be at a point where we incur that rate loss. Total surplus for society is at maximum. Well, what's one way that the government can shift the supply curve?
They can say,
Yeah, right. We said another way is maybe I set a tax, right? If I tax something, we said that raises the marginal cost or decreases my supply curve. So if the government steps in and said, okay, look, if you want to produce however many gallons of oil now, you have to pay this much for each gallon, right? So they're going to tax the production of this good, which essentially raises the marginal cost until the cost to those producers, or sorry, I wrote B here. I'm talking and writing. This was the marginal social cost. Sorry about that. Until the marginal social cost is exactly equal to the cost of those producers. How can I increase the cost of those producers? Take my original supply curve right, and now I'm just taxing them. So one way I can force this market to this lower quantity, right, is by taxing whatever good produces this negative externality. Does that make sense? Do you remember that? So we said that this goes back a ways, right? So this is where the final is not comprehensive, other than the sense that we were building on things, right? We said when we tax goods, it's like increasing the marginal cost of those producers, which decreases their supply curve. So if we tax them enough, they'll be operating off of a supply curve that matches up with or lines up with our marginal social costs. So what would the perfect value of this tax be? So remember, what was the difference in between these lines? I was calling that difference between the producer's marginal cost and society's would just be external cost, right? That was the additional cost that people outside that market were incurring. So how could I get my supply curve to perfectly match up to society's costs? If I charged a tax that was exactly equal to that external cost. Because if I have a tax exactly equal to that external cost, well, that was just the difference in between private producers' supply curve and marginal social cost. So one way we can kind of remedy these markets that have negative externalities to other people is to try to tax those guys. Any questions? So, now I want to kind of see if you guys are following along. Okay, so kind of work through a couple questions here. I just want to kind of see where we're at with this. We'll keep talking about externalities today in next class, but I want to kind of get a little bit of a idea of where you guys are at. So hopefully the frequency is showing up. I think maybe the order in which I did things last class, it was freaking out. So if you can't see it, please let me know. So let's say we've got the market for electricity here. And we're thinking about, I've got kind of some setup like this. All right, so I've got curves A, B, and C. If I want to know, right, which of these represents the true social cost to the society for electricity, right? Which of these is going to represent my marginal social cost? And then we'll talk about why we know that has to represent my marginal social costs. If you're following along, this one shouldn't be too bad. Right? I'll give you a hint. Those three curves represent the marginal social cost, supply, and demand. So which of those represents our marginal social cost? Might be things on the board that help. All right. So if you haven't gotten a response in, get one in now. We got what, 35 people here today? 36, everyone got an answer in? All right, I'm gonna close it out. So hopefully, I'm afraid to look at this. Okay, pretty close, right? Why do I know this has to be B?
Well, if there's a $15 cost added to each unit, you can see that because A starts at 10, and then B starts at 25, so that's
Yeah,
15.
first of all, I mean, if you're paying attention to what I just did, I got them labeled up here, right, already. Now, if you weren't, we kind of think about this as, well, we know that the demand curve reflects marginal benefits, and marginal benefits are diminished, right? So these downward sloping curves should represent benefits. Upward sloping curves represent that as we want to produce more, we have to use less and less efficient resources, so our marginal costs are increasing. So right away, A and B, we should be thinking about, these are our cost curves. Now, the reason why we know B is the social cost here, when I've got this additional $15 cost to society, is because that additional $15 cost to society represents kind of this external cost to production. Right? So the difference in between my supply curve and my marginal social cost curve should be $15. Well, if it's $15 higher at every quantity, then that would make B my marginal social cost curve. Now, if I didn't tell you the cost was 15, you knew it's 15 because, well, you could actually choose any quantity. Probably choosing a quantity of 0 would be the easiest one here. But at a quantity of 0, if marginal costs are 10 and social costs are 25, the difference in between those two curves, that's the external cost. That's the additional social cost. The difference in between 10 and 25 is that $15 social cost. Yeah.
So in a way, the tax is $15.
So if I wanted to correct this market, well, we'll hold off on that. But I'll come back to that, but I want to go through one more before we do that. Because I'll kind of, I think, spoil things here. Okay, so the next thing we would want to do is then think about, okay, which of these price quantity combinations would the free market arrive at? So if the producers and consumers who aren't taking into consideration society make their decisions, what will be the kind of perfectly competitive equilibrium in quantity here in this market? Oh, I guess if I open it up, that would help. So give you a little bit of time to work on that. Like I said, talk to people around you, make sure you're getting these correct. These shouldn't be too difficult. I'm just trying to get an idea of where we're at here today.
Maybe 60. No. You said not involving social cost.
Nope. So these are just the producers and consumers in the market arriving at that perfectly competitive kind of equilibrium, like what we were looking at before, without factoring in the social costs.
Yeah, you're right. Because we're not talking about the social cost there.
I can see that.
All right. You haven't got an answer in. Take your best guess here. Thought we had 36 before, so hold up. There we go. All right. I'm gonna close it out. 37. I guess missed someone the first one. Okay, so kind of using what we have on the board to help. If I'm thinking about where do the consumers and producers buy that, well, they're just going to be making decisions off their own marginal costs and marginal benefits. So this goes just back to what we were doing before the perfectly competitive markets. That long run equilibrium is where supply hits demand, right? Or where the private marginal costs are the same as the private marginal benefits. We're out at this point. All right, so if we look here, it'd be what, a quantity of 60, price of 40. So what if instead, I don't think you guys answer this one, but we'll kind of talk through it together. So hopefully, let me see here. Okay, pretty good, pretty good. So we're all close to fun. A lot of us are good at time. So if I instead think about, well, where's the socially optimal point? What price quantity combination is that? All right, so it's going to be where my marginal benefit curve. Now, here's where it gets a little tricky. We're going to add some stuff later on. Because I don't have any external benefits or any positive externalities, my private marginal benefits are the same as society's, right? There's no difference in between those two, but there's no additional benefits in this market. So it's really, I guess, a more technical way of saying where my society wants to be is where the marginal social benefit is equal to my marginal social cost, right? It's just that there's no additional benefits, so the demand curve really is my marginal social benefits. So that would be what? A quantity of 50 and a price of 50. So we said before the equilibrium that we were at, let me see here if I got, there we go, was 60-40. I know that if I just allow producers and consumers to operate freely, they're going to produce a quantity that's not optimal for society, right? That actually causes surplus for society to be lower. So how can I force those producers and consumers to kind of arrive at a point that's efficient for society? Taxing. As I tax them, right, now their marginal costs are whatever they were before, plus the value of that tax. So the value of the tax I would want here will be exactly equal to that additional social cost, which was $15. Yeah.
So essentially that just cuts out the dead weight loss, right?
Yeah, so that would actually reduce dead weight loss for society.
Okay.
I won't push you this far, but you could actually think about in pushing producers and consumers back to this lower quantity, I've actually caused dead weight loss in the market, right? So before, right, if they would have been operating out here, our original models, dead weight loss for the producers and consumers becomes this, right? But just because producers and consumers are losing out, by pushing it back to this lower quantity, we've increased, well, I shouldn't say we've increased the benefits. We've taken away a lot of costs for society. So yeah, there will be dead weight loss for producers and consumers, but we were eliminating dead weight loss for society. Is that, so think about it as, here, I'll give you some numbers. So let's think about, let's say before, when we're operating out at this point, I don't know, producer and consumer surplus are 100. The cost to society is something like, I don't know, negative 100. So we think about total surplus. What would total surplus be here? 100 plus 100 minus 100. 100, right? These are society's costs. What if producers and consumers then we have this tax, we're operating at a much lower point. So now maybe we have producer and consumer surplus is now lower, right? There's dead weight loss in the market. But you know, now maybe at that lower quantity, the cost to society are only negative 50. All right, we've reduced the cost to society, now total surplus, and they're going to be 50. Or actually, sorry, I need a larger value that down. I want, what's the point I want to make here? Yeah, so here, let's say, you can make it, I need these to be a little bit higher. So let's say this was 75 and 75. So we're reducing surplus. And then, let's say now in doing that, we reduce the cost of society, right? Well, you can kind of imagine now, for society, they're better off, even though producers and consumers are worse off. Now I'm just choosing these numbers here, they'll line up with any actual functions, and that's why I got the numbers a little bit wrong in my head first. But the idea there is that we're reducing producer and consumer surplus with that tax, but that tax is really kind of helping out society, right? It's really reducing those costs that society would incur. Any other questions on that? So we have kind of the flip side of things, which is what if we have additional benefits to society, right? Or what we'll call positive externalities. So negative externalities, we kind of thought about as, well, now our social costs are higher. With positive externalities, we can think about our social benefits are higher. So I've got, here's my price, quantity, Here's my supply curve, which represents marginal costs. Demand curve represents marginal benefits. If we've got additional benefits to people outside this market, we'll call this, what do we have? There we go, our external benefit, right? So just like the additional costs were the external costs, here we've got external benefits. So let's say we're looking at the production of education. So let's say we're looking at the production of education, right? I think I brought this example up on Monday about kind of degrees, right? So when you obtain a degree, it's better for society. People that weren't even involved in that market of you getting it, consuming or producing a degree. So at every single quantity produced, every single degree issued, society has this external benefit, right? So no matter what the quantity is, we see that for society, the overall benefit is much larger than just the private benefits, right? There's benefits to you from having that degree, but other people benefit as well, right? So just like these external or additional costs from negative externalities shifted our, well, I shouldn't say it shifted, but it made our social costs higher than the private costs. Additional benefits or positive externalities will push society's benefits to be greater than just the private benefits. Well, now we can start to think about, well, where would the kind of equilibrium be if we allow this market to operate freely, or kind of our perfectly competitive price and quantity? What's the optimal point for society? Well, now we're going to have the flip side. We've got society's benefits and society's costs, because there are no negative externalities in this market. Well, that's just the same as the private costs, right? There were no, now we're just looking at positive externalities. We ditched the negative externality markets, right? We're looking at something that has positive externalities. So for society, where does marginal social cost equal marginal social benefit? Somewhere out here. So for society, we kind of think about they would actually like, excuse me, that price for that good to be set higher, but for the quantity to also be higher, right? That would be kind of the equilibrium price quantity combination for society. So when you have negative externalities, this is where I think it's intuitive, right? If you have negative externalities, we said that basically these consumers and producers aren't taking into consideration the additional cost of society, so they produce too much, right? They produce more than the socially optimal quantity. If we got external benefits, they're not taking into consideration with their decision making the benefits to people other than themselves. So they produce at a point that's going to be lower than what would be optimal for society, right? Because they're thinking the benefits aren't as large as they are, they're not going to produce at this higher quantity. So, oops, we can kind of see here, think about it as if we allow the market to operate freely, they will underproduce, right? They won't produce a quantity that's socially optimal. They'll be producing at a point that's below that. And we can kind of show that if this is my marginal social cost curve, here's my marginal social benefits. If producers and consumers stop here, we'll notice we're losing out on all this possible surplus, right? For society, because for society, the difference between their social costs and their social benefits represents this area. So if we just allow the market to operate freely, producing at this lower quantity, we're losing out on all this additional surplus for society. So what I've got there actually would represent what?
Deadweight loss.
Yeah, it's the loss of surplus to society. That's society's deadweight loss, right? So kind of think about that. We're still identifying it the same way. It's just that before it was the overproduction incurred these additional costs, the difference between my marginal social benefit and marginal social cost curve. But now it's that underproduction I'm losing out on these potential positive gains. So kind of no matter whether we have negative or positive externalities, we still get this outcome that's not good for society, which is that total surplus is not maximized and we incur some deadweight loss if we just allow markets to kind of operate freely. Okay. Questions on this before I keep moving? We have on time. I think I've got kind of a similar kind of setup here in the slide. If we go through, well, let's go through these eye clickers, and then I've got two other things that I want to make sure we do. So I won't make you kind of respond, we'll just kind of talk about them as a whole, or at least this first one. So let's say I've got an external benefit to society here. What would the optimal price and quantity be for society? Sorry, what would the optimal price and quantity be for the free market or a perfectly competitive market? Well, there's producers and consumers going to make a decision. So it's just like with negative externalities. It's just going to be where our supply curve hits our demand curve. Now, why do I know this gray line is my demand curve? Because if there's these additional benefits in this market, my social benefits would have to be above the private benefits, right? Because that's the consumer's private benefits plus this external benefit. So here I have what? Equilibrium quantity of 30, price of 50. So why is this? That's not right. It should be 30-50, right? Yeah, 30-50. I'll make sure I change that when I upload the complete version to the slide. If I then think about what's the socially optimal quantity, well, there it should be, you know, the marginal cost curve is no different from the producers in society now, because there's no external costs. So it's where does that marginal social cost hit my marginal social benefit curve? Should be out here at the point of 40 to 60. Okay. Questions? I think it's just like the different side of the coin. We're looking at positive externalities, but all the same principles apply. So how can we correct these markets? Right? Well, I talked about we can tax producers when there's negative externalities, kind of make them incur this additional cost themselves, right? And make that match up with that external cost to other people, and we could exactly get to that socially efficient quantity. Here, one thing that we didn't touch on before the end of the first exam, which I have to come back to now, is this idea of subsidies. So subsidies really operate just the exact opposite of taxes. Okay. So has anybody heard of subsidies? How would you describe a subsidy? You guys have it here, heard people complain about these, right? Like no one's heard anyone ever complain about farm subsidies. So I guess I'm the only one. So we give subsidies to things. I mean, a lot of farmers will get subsidized to grow certain crops. The one I always use, just because like it blows my mind. I don't think it's still this much, but I know initially when they were putting them up, I think it was like $10,000 per windmill. You ever drive through some of these rural Indian towns and you see fields of windmills? But they basically get paid for every windmill they put up. The government gives them money. So what that's essentially saying is, okay, whatever the benefits were privately to consumers and producers of windmills before, well, now there's a huge additional benefit or an additional incentive to build that windmill. So the benefits are whatever they were before, plus however much the government's going to give me to produce that, right? So we can kind of think about it as it's like before the tax, it was the supply curve plus the tax. Now it's our demand curve plus the subsidy, right? They're getting paid an additional amount of money to produce that. So you can kind of see, you know, it pushed this out to a higher quantity, which, you know, we could argue here in a second. Was that a good thing? Right? Well, I won't go through dead weight loss with subsidies. We're going to punt on that. I'm not going to make you guys do that. Just know that with subsidies, we do have dead weight loss existing. Maybe we'll come back to that Friday and I'll show you that. But for today, I'm not going to kind of walk through it, but just know that when we do have subsidies, just like with taxes, there's dead weight loss to the producers and consumers in that market. Now, the reason why we might like subsidies, so why the government isn't always bad, is let's assume it was an industry, so maybe we'll use windmills, that this clean energy, right, gets rid of a lot of extra pollution, right? So before, when I was producing energy, so don't think about this as this quantity of windmills, but like quantity of like kilowatt hours or however you want to measure energy there. Before, the market was producing this much, right, from clean kind of Well, if there's additional benefits, right? If we produce more electricity with these clean energy sources, then actually the efficient point for society would be way out here. So how can I encourage or how can I push the market out this socially optimal quantity? Subsidies. Subsidies will shift that demand curve up until, well, if I do it perfectly, if I can get the subsidy such that the original demand curve plus that subsidy is exactly equal to the marginal social benefits, I can get that market to arrive at the socially efficient quantity. So just like with taxes, I can push that supply curve up to get back down to that socially efficient quantity. With subsidies, I can push markets up to whatever that socially efficient quantity is. Is that at least intuitively the kind of the idea behind what you're doing? And it kind of makes sense, right? Taxes are supposed to disincentivize you from doing something. You can think about like I don't know if this is cigarette specific taxes, but tobacco taxes. That's because the government says if everyone's smoking, and then we have all these huge healthcare costs, and then they bog down the system, that costs everybody in society, not just the person who developed lung cancer or whatever it was from smoking, right? So what do? They want to start taxing that. They want to discourage the use of that good, pushing it down to society's kind of lower efficient quantity. If there's things like, I don't know, education, college education, that the government knows like, yeah, once people kind of obtain this degree, their overall knowledge doesn't just benefit them, but it benefits society as a whole. They can come up with better, products. They can come up with new, inventions, whatever, go down that line. And so if there's an additional benefit to society, maybe we want to subsidize education, right? So subsidize education with things like Pell Grants, all right, and some of these other government issued, money that can be put towards college. But the main one, and there's a huge issue with this, but it is what they are attempting to do, is they also provide subsidized loans, right? When you hear that word subsidized loans, who's subsidizing that? Who's paying that company to be able to offer you different rates or guarantee that company will give you money for college? The government, right? So if they want higher levels of education, they can subsidize that money that's available for you to then pursue that education. So that's kind of the idea behind additional benefits, positive externalities, use subsidies, kind of get to those socially efficient points. We have negative externalities. We said we can use taxes to get to those socially efficient points. I had this thought, this maybe speaks to how my brain works, but I was thinking about this morning, and I think it's a good example for this discussion of that we're having. So let's say, and you could disagree with me, I guess if there's any atheists in the room, you're going to have like a huge kind of probably issue with what I'm saying here, but just let's assume that this is what's going on. So let's assume that there are some additional benefits to society from people being involved in some type of organized religion. I'm not saying which one, like just any type of organized religion. It builds a moral code, right? You might live your life a little bit more as kind of a society, whatever community you're in, and that maybe there's benefits to society. Right? So if that would be the case, right? And if we're thinking about the quantity of churches produced or sermons given or whatever it is, right? We might actually want that to be higher, right? The socially efficient quantity might actually be higher than where we're currently at. I can give my own kind of view of it. It's like, the private marginal benefits to me of attending a church service are relative, right? So if you let me decide how many I'm going to go to, it's probably zero, right? But maybe if I attended, I become a better person, right? I have a better moral code. Maybe that's better for society overall. So, especially back in the day, I think the government definitely adhered to this kind of line of thinking. So it's a little bit tricky because it's not that they necessarily subsidize religion, right? So if I think there should be more people attending these religious services, I'd want to somehow subsidize this market. I don't know, give people $10 for every sermon they attended something, right? But instead what they do is they actually don't give churches additional benefits. but they lower their costs, which is essentially the same thing. So you can think about it as, I could use subsidies to kind of push up that demand curve. Or if I think about people who are producing kind of religious services, the churches, what does the government do? Well, everything else, every other business is like, you kind of think about it as they have to pay taxes, right? There's sales tax, right? And there's income, there's all these tax. What do religious organizations not have to do? They pay taxes. So essentially, they should be operating off this supply curve, but because they're tax exempt, they get pushed down. Kind of think about this as like, I don't know, plus tax free, right? We're getting rid of those taxes. And so I'm actually reducing the cost to those churches. So what happens? I end up at kind of this higher equilibrium number of churches or sermons provided or something like that. So it gets a little tricky. I wouldn't personally like this for on the exam or anything. But you can think about one way we could correct this market is to subsidize religion. But it's really the flip side of that is, well, I'm not necessarily subsidizing churches, but if I'm telling them they don't have to pay any taxes, essentially I'm giving them money, right? Because if I didn't say that, they'd have to give that money to me. So it's kind of like we're producing these additional benefits in that market by making these religious institutions tax-free. So maybe there's like a, I guess that would be an argument that, maybe this is a good thing. I'm sure there's plenty of other arguments, but if it's not, we could build a more complicated model to show that maybe this is actually going to bring additional deadweight losses because there may not be positive externalities to religion, but there may be also some negative ones as well, imposition and whatnot. So we'll kind of pick up on this next class. We'll go through some more externality stuff, and we'll then start thinking about different types of goods where we see these positive negative externalities exist. Okay.